We're starting to read the next couple of chapters out of the Code Talker, where we left off. The kids had just arrived at the boarding school. Chapter 3, To Be Forgotten. They took away our hair. My children, Mr. John Bentley said, after teaching us how to say hello in English, I'm sorry, but you must go now into this room. We did as he asked. One by one, we herded into a little shed where 3 tall, uniformed Navajo boys, whose hair was as short as Mr. John Bentley's, were waiting. I should explain, grandchildren, that in those days among our people, both men and women always kept their hair long. It was a sacred thing. Cutting your hair was believed to bring misfortune to you. But at mission school, they had other beliefs. I was the first one in line. 2 of the uniformed boys took me by my arms, one on each side, and pulled me over to a chair. What are you doing? I asked in Navajo, just loud enough so they could hear. But they did not answer me. Instead, they pushed me down into that hard wooden chair and held me firmly, as if I were a sheep about to be sheared. Then another boy with a big pair of scissors chopped off my hair. He did it so quickly that it was over almost before I knew it. Another stunned child was being led in and shoved into that chair even before I was out the door. Both boys and girls had their hair cut. The only difference was that the hair of the girls was left a little longer than the boys'. But I could see from the looks on their faces that losing most of their beautiful hair made those girls feel the same way I felt, naked and ashamed. Not only our hair was stripped away. After being shorn, we were led into 2 separate buildings, one for the boys and another for the girls. Once we were inside, we were made to take off all our fine clothing and our jewelry. We never saw those clothes or jewels again. Years later, I learned that our squash blossom necklaces and turquoise bracelets, earrings and hair ornaments and silver belts were sold to white men and women. In exchange for my clothing and jewelry, I was issued a military-style uniform made of cloth that was rough and itchy and a stiff cap that was shoved down into my head. The uniform and cap were too big for me, so big that my cap came down over my eyes. They made no difference to the older students who were handing out our new clothing. Once I was dressed, I was pushed out into the schoolyard. There, we new students were formed into a line and made to stand at attention, with the boys on one side of the yard and the girls, who were now wearing long brown dresses, aprons, and head coverings, on the other. It was so strange. Where only a few moments before there had been a colorful crowd of Navajo children, each one different from the other, now we all looked just the same. In our drab uniforms, the only difference between us boys was our size. Of course, I was the smallest one. I remember thinking that they had removed from us everything that we owned. But I was wrong. There was still one more thing to be taken. We were led one by one to stand in front of a skinny white man with yellow hair who was sitting at a desk. A whiteboard with curved black marks on it was propped up on that desk. None of us could read English, but I learned later that those curving marks that twisted like worms were the letters of the man's name, Mr. Reamer. I also learned later that he always did the job he was about to do with his new students, because he had convinced himself that he understood our language. Mr. John Bentley stood close to help with the translating as Mr. Reamer asked each child the name of his or her father. That translation would help decide each student's new last name in English. For example, one of the boys in our group said he was the son of one who has roan horses. His name became John Roanhorse. Mr. Reamer seemed very fond of the name John and gave it to lots of boys. Also, if he did not like the way someone's last name sounded in English when it was translated from Navajo, he would just choose another last name and give it to that boy or girl. We did not know it at the time, but some of the last names we got were the names of famous dead white men: Washington, Lincoln, Jefferson, and so on. That was shocking to me when I discovered it later. Among our people, no one is ever deliberately given the name of someone who has died. When it came to be my turn, I stood at attention in front of the desk. The skinny, yellow-haired white man said something to me. What he said sounded very strange. It did not sound like any language I'd ever heard before, not even the English that everyone around us was now speaking. Once again, the white man made those unpleasant noises. He sounded like someone trying to speak when his mouth is full of food. He thinks he's talking Navajo, Mr. John Bentley whispered into my ear. He's trying to ask you the name of your father. I'm the son of the one with the gray mustache, I said. Huh, said Mr. Reamer as he wrote something down on his paper. Another be gay. Because that white teacher could not really understand our language, he did not realize that Bai in Navajo just means son of, so he made Bai my last name, although he wrote it as he heard it, Gay. Lots of other white men at other schools did the same. That's why we now have so many Navajo families like our own with the last name of Begay. But at least I was not named John. By the time the skinny white man got to me, he had already made more than 20 boys John, and he was tired of writing that name. So I was given the same first name as that teacher's dead uncle, Ned. Thus it was grandchildren that I began my day as Giyatsi and ended it as Nebigay. Chapter 4, Progress. Tradition is the enemy of progress. That was written in large letters on the big wooden sign in front of the mission school. It was the first thing we were taught to read. Anything that belonged to the Navajo way was bad, and our Navajo language was the worst. Without thinking, when I saw Mr. Reamer the second day I was at mission school, I spoke the polite Navajo greeting my parents had told me I should always use to an elder. Instead of greeting me back, he yelled something, slapped his hand over my mouth, and picked me up under his arm like it was a little puppy who had done something bad. He carried me inside to the sink, where there was a bar of brown soap floating in a bucket, forced me to open my mouth, and then shoved that big wet bar of soap into it. He rubbed it back and forth between my teeth so hard that foam came out of my mouth and my nose. The soap even got into my eyes, and I couldn't see. I choked and coughed and thought I was going to die. Finally, Mr. Reamer decided I'd had enough. He ducked my head into the bucket, dropped me on the floor, and just walked away as if nothing unusual had happened. I staggered outside and fell down to my knees. My vision was blurry, and my lips were cut and bleeding. Tommy Nez, who was the first friend I'd made in school, lifted me to my feet. He and another bigger boy I hadn't met, whose bunk was close to mine, had to help me get back to the dormitory, because I could not walk without falling. My relative, you will return to balance again, that bigger boy, whose name I later learned was Jesse Chi, whispered in my ear in Navajo, "The holy people have not forgotten you." Somehow Jesse knew that I had to hear our language, just then, though it was a risk even to whisper it. Those teachers had ears that seemed to hear our thoughts. I knew I had found another friend. I also knew that I never wanted to experience that awful soap again, so I tried my best to avoid speaking Navajo when any adult could hear. I never had my mouth washed out again, but still, to this day, I cannot see a brown bar of soap without feeling a little sick to my stomach. That same punishment was given to other boys and girls who spoke Navajo. Whenever they did so, their mouths would be washed out. It happened to Jesse, to Tommy, to Samuel, and to everyone I knew. I didn't think a single child escaped having his or her mouth roughly washed out with the soap. Most learned their lesson quickly and watched what they said. However, some of the children were not just forgetful about using our language, they were openly defiant. They refused to give up speaking Navajo, so they were beaten with heavy sticks. Principal O'Sullivan, who was also the head disciplinarian, punished the most defiant children. He had a favorite stick that hung on the wall behind his desk. Sometimes he would beat the boys and girls so badly that they would not be able to walk the next day. John Roanhorse, who also had a bed in my part of the dormitory, was one of the most stubborn ones. His mouth was washed out so often that it no longer seemed to bother him. "That soap's not so bad," he said to Jesse and Tommy and me one night in the dormitory. "I'm getting to like the taste of it." Even being beaten did not stop John Roanhorse from speaking Navajo. He was the biggest of the boys, and he would stand there, taking a beating without crying. Principal O'Sullivan just about wore himself out hitting him. He even broke one of his favorite sticks over John's back. So it was decided that a simple beating was not enough. John was taken into the cold stone basement and chained in a dark corner. He was kept there for a week with nothing to eat but pieces of stale bread and nothing to drink but water. When they brought him out, his eyes seemed as small as those of a mole, and there was a lost look on his face. I think a part of his spirit was left down in that cold, dark place. I was never openly defiant like John had been, nor was I like the careless boys and girls who kept speaking Navajo when our teachers, who watched us the way coyotes watch a prairie dog hole, could hear them. I did my best to learn English. As the days turned into weeks, then months, and years, I began not just to do well in my classes, but to do better than any other student, especially in such subjects as history and geography. Learning and remembering things of the past and finding out about faraway places was interesting to me. I seemed to be a perfect student. When my English teachers looked at me, they saw a little Navajo boy who did just what he was told, never got in trouble and studied hard. Whenever I was called on, I would stand right up. Yes, teacher, I would say, widening my eyes and nodding my head as I spoke. Yes, teacher. Those were the two words I spoke more than any others when I was in mission school. They were like magic. Even if I did not understand something, all I had to do was say those words to make my white teachers nod back at me and smile. Sometimes they did not even ask me to answer the question. Very good, Nettie, they would say. However, I was stubborn in ways the teachers could not see. I spoke nothing but Navajo whenever I was alone with other Indian students. In the basement of the school or out back behind the woodshed, I learned Navajo songs and stories. Some students in that school, especially after being beaten enough times for talking Indian, reached the point where it became hard for them to speak Navajo, even if they wanted to. But it was not that way for me. If anything, rather than taking my language away from me, boarding school made me more determined never to forget it. So I held on to my sacred language while learning the words and the ways of the whites. But I had no idea, even in my wildest dreams, that the very language those English teachers tried to erase, the way you wipe words from a blackboard, would one day be needed by important white men. High school. At first, my time in the boarding school did not go quickly. In fact, the days were so long that it sometimes seemed as if each one was a year. Despite the boredom and the loneliness, I kept on working hard. Trying to do well became my way of surviving, just as some of the other students got by simply by going somewhere else inside themselves, showing a blank and stupid face to our teachers whenever they were asked to do anything. Then those teachers would shake their heads and go on to someone else. Most of those teachers expected very little of us, and that was just what some of us gave back in return. But that was not my way. I've always loved to learn, even though the learning way they offered us was much less than that given to the other children. Some of my other classmates survived boarding school by throwing themselves into the sports that we played. The older boys had basketball, baseball, and football teams. After we younger boys got to know those sports, which none of us had ever seen before being sent off to school, we too became great fans. Some of us wanted nothing more than to become one of those heroic Indian athletes like Jim Thorpe, who wore a sports uniform and did great things on the playing field. Whenever you played a game against other Indian schools, I was always among those cheering loudly for our side. But little I was when I came to school, and little I stayed. I grew some, but reluctantly, I'd never been more than a few inches above 5 feet. I was too small to play sports. I couldn't hope to become one of those athletes who recklessly threw their bodies against each other with as much energy as our warriors in the old days had hurled themselves at our enemies.